should we start? Apa perlu dimulai?
Kita tunggu 5 menit lagi, Ibu Asna.
Oke, terima kasih.
Saya memperkenalkan dulu. Perkenalkan, saya Muhammad Masrur Irsyadi. Saya adalah salah satu panitia di acara Symposium Internasional tentang Moderasi Beragama yang diselenggarakan oleh El-Bukhari Institute bekerja sama dengan Laboratorium Pengembangan Sosial Keagamaan Aceh, UIN Araniri, beserta dan didukung oleh Kementerian Agama Republik Indonesia. Sesi kali ini kita akan menghadirkan 4 pembicara dari bisa dikatakan dari 4 negara yang berbeda. Karena itu pada kesempatan kali ini tersedia layanan interpreter di masing-masing di kolom di ruang Zoom Bapak Ibu. Jadi saat ini nanti sesi pertama akan disampaikan oleh Dr. Gammal. Dr. Gammal akan berbicara tentang kenapa kita perlu mewujudkan moderasi beragama dalam kehidupan keagamaan kita, dan itu karena beliau akan berbicara dalam bahasa Arab, Bapak Ibu bisa pilih untuk diterjemahkan ke bahasa Indonesia dengan pilih bahasanya Indonesia. Begitu juga nanti 3 pembicara selanjutnya karena akan berbicara mayoritas dalam bahasa Inggris, maka Bapak Ibu juga bisa pilih dengan bahasa Indonesia. Wa kadzalika la aqas li Dr. Gammal hinama takallama al-hadirun bil lughatil Indonesia hinama yas'al ilaik au ila ghairik minal mutakallimin hunaka at-tarjamah al-fawriyah abro hadza Zoom wa sayutarjam ilal arabiyah minal Indonesia ilal arabiyah wahidut talamzik al-akh Saiful Anwar wa sayutarjim aidan ila Indonesia wa ilal aqs minal Indonesia al-akh Jayhan Adam wa huwa aidan khirij Hammad bin Khalifa al-Jami'ah Hammad bin Khalifa. Setelah di tepat 15.05 nanti saya serahkan langsung kepada Prof. Asna Husin untuk memulai sesi ini, Bu.
Bisa kita mulai? Kita tunggu 2 menit lagi?
Kita akan tunggu 3 menit lagi, Bu.
Oke, terima kasih. Nanti di apa namanya, raise hand ya, kalau udah mau mulai disampaikan ya.
Baik. Untuk Saiful sudah clear interpret ini, maksudnya sudah jelas untuk penerjemahan.
Nah.
Baik, bismillah. Bu Asna, bisa dimulai, Bu. Oh, Bu Asna terlempar ya? Selamat datang Pak James Hoesterey. Welcome to the Zoom room. Halo Pak.
Bu Asna keluar ya?
Iya betul Pak, sehat.
Sebentar, saya konfirmasi ya.
Atau kita mulai saja Pak, sehat, karena Pak Gammal
boleh. Pengantarnya langsung. Ini saya konfirmasi dulu. Silakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wa bihi nasta'in ala umuri dunya waddin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi washabihi ajmain. Selamat sore, dan pertama selamat datang untuk para pembicara. Al-awwal Dr. Mohamed El-Gammal min Jami'atul Hammad bin Khalifa min Qatar. Kemudian ada Pak James Hoesterey dari Emory University, Amerika Serikat. Kita masih menunggu dua pembicara lagi nanti daripada Pak Duderija dari Griffith University, dan ada Mrs. Shahrbanou dari Sciences Po Paris, Perancis. Tapi supaya lebih supaya mempersingkat waktu, karena waktu kita saat ini jika dikonversi ke waktu Dr. Gammal, saat ini beliau sudah sampai tadi sudah terdengar suara azan, jadi beliau waktunya tidak banyak, jadi beliau akan menyampaikan dulu sedikit, kemudian beliau akan leave sebentar untuk melakukan sholat Jumat. Falyatafaddal ila Dr. Mohamed Gammal ilqi al-muhadaran limaza tahtaj al-wasatiyah.
شكرا جزيلا لكم. شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين وأصلي وأسلم على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وبعد. فأشكر القائمين على المؤتمر بوزارة الشؤون الدينية بجمهورية إندونيسيا على الدعوة الكريمة وعلى الجهود الكبيرة والملموسة لإنجاح المؤتمر، كما أشكر زملائي وإخواني المشاركين في المؤتمر، وأخص بالذكر منهم الصديق سيف الأنوار وجيهان على كل ما قدماه في هذا الشأن. مداخلتي تتعلق بالإجابة على سؤال: لماذا كان فهم وسطية الدين ضرورة؟ أنا أعتقد من البداية أن وسطية الدين أو مفهوم الوسطية محل إشكال. لماذا؟ لأن الناس دائما ينظرون إلى أن الوسط هو الطريق بين أمرين، بين التساهل أو الإفراط والتفريط، إفراط من جهة وتفريط من جهة، فإذا وقع بينهما كانت هذه هي الوسطية. والحقيقة أن الوسطية بهذا المعنى تأتي في بعض الصور أو في صور كثيرة في التشريعات الإسلامية وتأتي عليها، لكن هذا المعنى أيضا لا يشمل كل معاني الوسطية، لأن الوسطية تعني العدل في الأحكام، تعني الأحكام التي أتت من عند الله تعالى، فهي تمثل الوسطية. يعني لو مثلنا مثالا بسيطا في التربية، لو واحد ربى ولده وحافظ عليه واهتم بكل شؤونه واهتم بأموره كلها وأفهمه الصحيح من الخطأ، حينئذ الناس يقولون هذا متشدد، وفي الحقيقة أن هذا ليس نوع من التشدد، إنما هو مراعاة المربى في كل أحوالها، فهذا مطلوب. إذن الشريعة لما تأمر بأمر أو تنهى عن نهي لابد أن نفهمه أن هذا يحقق المصلحة، فأي حكم يحقق المصلحة في النهاية فهو يعني الوسطية. ولذلك مثلا جاء في الحديث: ما كان الرفق في شيء إلا زانه، وقول الله تعالى: وما جعل عليكم في الدين من حرج. إذن هذا في معايير الناس لا يعد من قبيل الوسطية. الرفق الشديد والتيسير الشديد لا يعد ذلك عند الناس من قبيل الوسطية، إنما يعد ذلك من قبيل اليسار. لكنه في الحقيقة ما دام يحقق مقاصد في النهاية، مقاصد شرعية سليمة تحافظ على الإنسان وتجعله دائما يسير نحو الأفضل، إذن هذا يعد من قبيل الوسطية. انظر أيضا إلى الجهاد في قول الله تعالى: يا أيها النبي جاهد الكفار والمنافقين واغلظ عليهم. هذه أيضا هي من الوسطية، لأنها تحقق الكرامة للمسلم وتحقق الكرامة لغير المسلمين وتحافظ على الناس عموما. هذه أيضا تعد من الوسطية، وإن كانت عند الناس أو عند المنظرين لا تعد كذلك. فإذا المعيار ليس هو التوسط بين أمرين، إنما المعيار الحقيقي والسليم والصحيح هو ما يحققه من آثار ونتائج، بعيدا عن موقعه بين الآراء الموجودة. انظروا أيضا إلى الحدود: الزانية والزاني فاجلدوا كل واحد منهما 100 جلدة. انظروا إلى قوله تعالى: والسارق والسارقة فاقطعوا أيديهما جزاء بما كسبا نكالا من الله. انظروا إلى قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في مانع الزكاة: تؤخذ الزكاة منه وشطر من ماله، عزمة من عزمات ربنا. إذن هذه التشديدات لا يمكن أن نطلق عليها غير وسطية أو فيها تشديد. لماذا؟ لأنها تؤول في النهاية إلى صلاح الإنسان وإلى المحافظة على حياته وإلى سلامته في الآخرة بإذن الله تعالى. إذن معيار الوسطية ليس دائما، نعم أحيانا يأتي بالتوسط بين أمرين، إنما ليس دائما كذلك، إنما يعني الأحكام السليمة الصحيحة التي نزلت من عند الله تعالى حتى تحافظ على الإنسان وتحافظ على المجتمع. فإذا رجعنا إلى الحدود، فالحدود كما تعلمون أنها فيها اعتداء على المجتمع. المرأة التي تزني أو الرجل الذي يزني أو السارق الذي يسرق لا يسرق من فرد واحد، إنما هو يعتدي على المجتمع. فإذا تكررت السرقات في المجتمع أرهب ذلك الناس وجعلهم يتركون المكان وينطلقون إلى مكان آخر ونحو ذلك. فهذا ليس فيه اعتداء على فرد بعينه، إنما هو اعتداء على المجتمع. إذن أهم معنى من المعاني التي لا بد أن نقف عندها هو أن مفهوم الوسطية لا يعني الوقوف بين طرفين، إنما يعني ذلك الحكم الصحيح والسليم الذي يؤدي في النهاية إلى مقصد صحيح يحافظ على الإنسان ويحافظ على المجتمع. ولذلك الشريعة لا تعرف مثلا الشخص المحايد، إما أن تكون مع الحق وإما أن تكون مع الباطل. ليس هناك شخص يمكن أن يطلق عليه محايد. فهذا المحايد الذي ينظر إليه على أنه وسطي هو في الحقيقة في معيار الشرع ليس كذلك، إنما معيار الشرع أن يتبع الإنسان الحق أو أن يتركه. فإذا كان متبعا له فهو محق، لأنه يكثر أعداد المسلمين ويحافظ على حقوقهم إلى غير ذلك من هذه المعاني. هذا المعنى الأول أردت أن أقف عليه. إذن الإرفاقات والتيسيرات الشديدة التي يعتبرها الناس أنها ليست من الوسطية هي من الوسطية، والحدود والأمور الكثيرة الموجودة في الشريعة التي تحفظ المجتمع وتحافظ على الإنسان هي ليست من التشديدات، وإنما هي من الوسطية. أيضا كثير من الناس ينظرون إلى أقوال الفقهاء على أنه إذا رأى رأيا يقول مثلا بالإباحة، ورأي آخر يقول بالوجوب، ورأي ثالث يقول بالاستحباب، يقول التوسط هو الاستحباب. هذه ليست حقيقة. أيضا الاستحباب لا يعد توسطا، والإباحة لا تعد توسطا، والوجوب لا يعد توسطا فقط. إنما كل هذه الآراء ما دامت صدرت من مجتهدين قادرين أحاطوا بالواقع وأحاطوا ولديهم الصنعة الفقهية ولم يخرجوا عن إطار الشريعة والتمسوا بمصادر الشريعة وأدواتها الحكم الصحيح والسليم، فهذه الاجتهادات كلها أمام الشرع اجتهادات متميزة نفاضل بينها بناء على ما تحققه من مصالح وما تؤول إليه من منافع. لا أستطيع أن آتي على دليل أو على رأي فأقول رأي الشافعية متشدد أو رأي الحنفية هنا متساهل أو نحو ذلك من هذه الأمور. إذن هذا المعيار لابد أن ننظر فيه أن ما يحقق المصلحة وما يؤول في النهاية إلى تحقيق الخير للناس وما يؤول إلى الآثار السلمية، الآثار المفيدة للناس، إذن هذه هي الوسطية. كذلك يعني انظروا مثلا إلى قضية الوسطية في أحكام الفقه الإسلامي أو أحكام الشريعة. الوسطية لها أشكال كثيرة ولها مظاهر متعددة. مثلا قلة الأحكام في الشريعة تعني الوسطية. الشريعة ذكرت فقط بعض العبادات أو العبادات أهم العبادات وهي قليلة جدا. ذكرت ما أطلق عليه الفقهاء المقدرات الشرعية. ذكرت حرم المقدرات الشرعية مثل المواريث، مثل العدة بالنسبة للنساء، مثل عدد الطلاق، مثل جزء الوصية ما يوصى به ونحو ذلك من هذه الأمور. هذه يطلق عليها مقدرات شرعية. أيضا في باب المعاملات حرمت الاحتكار، حرمت الغش، حرمت أكل أموال الناس بالباطل، حرمت الاستبداد في باب السياسة الشرعية، حرمت ظلم الناس إلى غير ذلك من هذه الأمور التي تعد من قبيل الأمور الأصلية التي يبنى عليها. ثم تركت مساحات كبيرة جدا للمجتهدين عبر العصور وعبر الأزمنة حتى يستفيدوا حتى يستفيد الناس من اجتهاداتهم. فلم تقيد الناس في كل الأمور بأحكام خاصة، إنما وضعت الأسس التي يبنى عليها الاجتهاد، ويمكن للناس ويمكن للعلماء عبر العصور أن يجتهدوا وأن يزيدوا في تلك الأحكام وأن يفيدوا الناس. ومن ثم استطاعوا بذلك في باب القضاء وفي باب الفتوى أن يفتوا للناس وأن يبحثوا عن مصالح الشرع، وحققوا الوسطية في كل الأمور، وحكموا الدنيا شرقا وغربا وشمالا وجنوبا. ولم يوجد في كتب التاريخ ما يدل على ظلم المسلمين لغيرهم أو الاعتداء عليهم، إنما كانت الحريات مكفولة ووسطية الدين ثابتة وواضحة لدى الناس. أيضا من ضمن المسائل التي تعد من قبيل الأسس والعلامات البارزة على وجود الوسطية هو وضوح منهج الاجتهاد. فالاجتهاد منهجه واضح. لدينا مذاهب فقهية 8، لدينا المذهب الحنفي والمالكي والشافعي والحنبلي والزيدي والإباضي والإمامي والظاهري. هذه المذاهب كلها مدارس فقهية. ما معنى مدارس فقهية؟ أن كل مدرسة من تلك المدارس لديها أصول معينة وقواعد معينة اختبرتها وامتحنتها كثيرا، وأتت الأجيال كثيرا، الأجيال التي أتت بعد الأجيال المؤسسة اهتمت بها ونظرت لها، واختبرت تلك المدارس حتى صارت بمثابة مصانع. أنت تدخل إليها المسائل الفقهية فتخرج لك المنتجات دون أن يكون هناك تعارض في العقل، دون أن يكون هناك ظلم لفئة على فئة، دون أن يكون هناك أي مشكلة من المشكلات. إذن المدارس الإسلامية والفقهية عبر التاريخ الإسلامي حققت للناس مصالح كثيرة جدا، واستطاعت أن تحقق الوسطية. لماذا؟ لأن مسألة الاجتهاد اهتموا بها. التأصيل الأصولي والقواعدي والأدوات التي استخدموها كانت واضحة وجربت تجريبا جيدا، ولذلك الأحكام التي خرجت منها كانت أحكام كما يقولون أحكام وسطية. نعم، قد لا يناسبنا منها الآن نظرا لتغير الزمان والمكان والأحوال والأشخاص والعوائد، قد لا يناسبنا منها كثير من الأحكام التي صدرت في التراث. هذا لا يعني أنها كانت خطأ في وقتها، إنما قد يكون بعضها لا يناسبنا الآن. وأيضا هذا من الوسطية التي ننادي بها في هذا الزمان. أيضا ثبوت عبقرية المسلمين في القضاء والسياسة والفتوى ونحو ذلك. فمع اطلاعنا كلنا، وأنا أعتقد المجموعة الموجودة وكثير منها اطلعوا على كتب التراث، مع قراءتنا الكثيرة جدا لم نجد من وجود مشاكل اجتماعية أو اقتصادية أو نحو ذلك من هذه المشاكل بسبب الاجتهادات نظرا لوسطية هؤلاء. قديما كان يشترط في القاضي والمفتي أن يكون مجتهدا، فهو كان لديه القدرة على الاجتهاد، فهو يفهم المصادر فهما جيدا، يفهم الواقع فهما جيدا، ثم يجتهد، فإذا باجتهاداته تحل مشاكل الناس. وفي الحقيقة هم أجابوا على أسئلة الواقع، أجابوا على أسئلة الواقع واستشرفوا المستقبل، وأجابوا على كل ما ورد إلى أذهانهم من قضايا نحن الآن نستفيد منها. أيضا في باب السياسة الشرعية ليست هناك صورة واحدة يمكن أن نطلق عليها أن هذا هو مقصود الشرعي فيما يتعلق بالسياسة. فالله عز وجل والنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وصحابته لم يجعلوا شكلا واحدا للسياسة أو شكلا واحدا للحكم، إنما وضعوا قواعد عامة مجردة يمكن هذه القواعد أن تحقق مصالح الناس في مرحلة من المراحل ولا تحققها في مرحلة آخر. يمكن أن نستفيد من الأمور الكثيرة التي تقع في حياتنا أو التي وصل إليها الناس مثل الديمقراطية وغيرها، يمكن أن نستفيد منها ونرد منها أيضا. الفقهاء المسلمين عبر العصور اخترعوا أهل الحل والعقد، وكان أهل الحل والعقد يعني اختراع إسلامي صحيح لم يطور، لكنه أمر مقبول. أيضا الشريعة من جهة أخرى اهتمت بالكليات، حددت الكليات، فهذه التشريعات يعني هذه التشريعات التي وردت الله عز وجل قصد منها أن تحافظ على الإنسان، أن تحافظ على الإنسان بكليته، تحافظ على دينه، تحافظ على جسده، تحافظ على عقله، تحافظ على نسله، تحافظ عليه. هذه كلها تمثل وسطية الدين، فهي لا تعني بالجزئيات بقدر اعتنائها بالكليات، ولا تهتم بتلك الأمور التفصيلية بقدر اهتمامها بالمصادر والأمور الكلية التي لا بد أن تحافظ عليها. إذن يمكن أن نضرب بعض الأمثلة على ذلك. الوسطية أن تلتزم أيضا بالحق وتبتعد عن الباطل. الوسطية في العبادات ألا تغلو فيها مع الناس وترهق المريض والضعيف والشيخ الكبير، ولذلك قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لمعاذ: أفتان أنت يا معاذ؟ وعلى ذلك فلا ينبغي أن يقال لمن التزم بدينه مغاليا، ولمن أخذ بالأيسر أنه مفرط أو متساهل، لأن الوسطية تعني مما تعني التيسير ومراعاة الأعراف والأحوال ونحو ذلك. إذا لا نعني بالوسطية التساهل ولا نعني بها التشدد، بل التزام الأحكام العادلة التي تحقق مصالح الناس، بشرط أن نتدرج في أخذ الناس بالأيسر، وأن نرفق بهم في الدعوة ونأخذ بالرخص في مواضعها. انظروا إلى حديث جابر بن عبد الله رضي الله عنهما قال: خرجنا في سفر فأصاب رجلا من حجر فشده في رأسه فصال أصحابه فقال: هل تجدون لي رخصة في التيمم؟ فقالوا: ما نجد لك رخصة وأنت تقدر على المال. فاغتسل فمات. فلما قدمنا على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أخبرناه بذلك فقال: قتلوه قتلهم الله، ألا سألوا إذا لم يعلموا فإنما شفاء العي السؤال. إلى آخر الحديث المتعلق بهذا. فكما تعلمون أن هذه الأمور هي تمثل وسطية الدين. لكن مع ذلك المعنى الشائع بين الناس أن بعض أحكام الشريعة تأتي على الوسط بين الإفراط والتفريط أو بين مذاهب الناس المعاصرة، فهذا أيضا موجود. فالإسلام مثلا يتوسط في المذهب الاقتصادي بين الرأسمالية والاشتراكية، وبين الإنفاق والتقتير، وبين التشدد والغلو، وبين المذاهب الأرضية في مسائل الزواج والطلاق والمواريث والوصايا وباقي الأحكام. وبهذا المعنى جاء قول الله تعالى: ولا تجهر بصلاتك ولا تخافت بها وابتغ بين ذلك سبيلا، أي طريقا متوسطا بين الأمرين، فلا تكون مجهورة ولا مخافة بها. وأيضا ننظر إلى قول الله تعالى: والذين إذا أنفقوا لم يسرفوا ولم يقتروا وكان بين ذلك قواما. وأيضا قول الله تعالى: ولا تجعل يدك مغلولة إلى عنقك ولا تبسطها كل البسط فتقعد ملوما محسورا. وأيضا أريد أن أضرب بعض الأمثلة لأن الوقت ضاق عندنا هنا للصلاة، وضاق أيضا في الوقت المخصص لي. انظروا إلى يعني روى أنس رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رأى شيخا يهادى بين ابنيه فقال: ما بال هذا؟ قال: نذر أن يمشي. قال: إن الله عن تعذيب هذا نفسه لغني، وأمره أن يركب. انظروا مثلا قول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: لا تطروني كما أطرت النصارى ابن مريم، لا تشددوا على أنفسكم فيشدد عليكم، إياكم والغلو في الدين، إلى غير ذلك من هذه الأمور. روي عن أبي الجنوب الأسدي قال: أتي علي بن أبي طالب برجل من المسلمين قتل رجلا من أهل الذمة. قال: فقامت عليه البينة فأمر بقتله، فجاء أخوه فقال: إني قد عفوت. قال: فلعلهم هددوك وفرقوك وفزعوك. قال: لا، ولكن قتله لا يرد علي أخي وعوضوني فرضيت. قال: أنت أعلم، من كانت له ذمتنا فدمه كدمنا وديته كديتنا. ونفس الموضع في التاريخ الإسلامي لدي شواهد كثيرة جدا في التاريخ الإسلامي تدل على قضية مراعاة الوسطية. انظروا مثلا إلى الخليفة العباس المنصور لما أمر الإمام مالك أن يجمع الناس على الموطأ، وصاه فقال: يا أبا عبد الله، ضم هذا العلم ودون كتبا وجنب فيه شدائد ابن عمر ورخص ابن عباس وشواذ ابن مسعود، واقصد أوسط الأمور وما اجتمع عليه الأئمة والصحابة. يعني ما أريد أن أقوله في النهاية أن الشريعة لا ينبغي أن ننظر إلى الوسطية على أنها أن تأتي بين المذاهب الأرضية أو بين آراء الناس، أن تكون الوسطية هي وسط بين الآراء. فهذا ليس دائما لأن الناس قد لا يصلون إلى الحكم السليم، والناس وإذا نزلت الشريعة من عند الله تعالى فهو أعلم الناس بما يصلح الإنسان. فقد لا يصل الناس إلى مثل هذه الأمور. الآن الناس يحرمون الجهاد، الناس يحرمون ويمنعون الحدود إلى غير ذلك من هذه الأمور، مع أنها تمثل الوسطية. لماذا؟ لأنها تحافظ على كرامة الإنسان وتحافظ كذلك على المجتمعات الإسلامية وغيرها. والأمر الثاني أنها في بعض الأمور وفي بعض المسائل وفي بعض القضايا أنها تأتي على الوسط بين المذاهب الأرضية أو بين اجتهادات الناس. فنجد كما رأينا أن الناس في حركته في الحياة لا يختال في مشيته ولا يختال بين الناس ولا يتكبر على الناس، وأيضا لا يذل نفسه، إنما يكون وسطا بين ذلك، معتزا بدينه ومعتزا بنفسه ومعتزا بما آتاه الله عز وجل، لكن لا يتكبر على الناس. أيضا في حركته في الإنفاق لا بد أن يكون وسطا، فلا ينفق كل ما لديه فيبقى محصورا، ولا يغل يده فيظلم نفسه ويظلم من حوله. نعم، الشريعة تأتي على الوسط دائما في مذاهب الأرضية، لكن لا بد أن نفهم أن الشريعة أرادت بالوسطية أن تحقق مصالح الناس في الدنيا والآخرة. ولذلك الشاطبي ركز على هذا المعنى في كتابه المقاصد، وبين أن مقصود المقصود، يعني هناك مقاصد وهناك مقصود المقاصد. قال إن مقصود المقاصد هو المداومة على الأعمال والتوازن بين الواجبات. فالشريعة لما راعت التيسير في أحوال الناس والناس اعتبروها أن هذا ليس من الوسطية، الشريعة أعلم بشؤون الناس، فلما راعت الشريعة الوسطية وراعت الرفق، وقال النبي: ما كان الرفق في شيء إلا زانه، لم يكن هذا خضوعا ولا خنوعا من الشريعة، إنما كان ذلك حتى يحافظ على الإنسان، حتى يستطيع الإنسان أن يداوم على أعماله. ولذلك النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بين أن أفضل الأعمال أقلها ما دام الإنسان يداوم عليها، المداومة على الأعمال حتى وإن كانت قليلة. لماذا؟ لأن هذه تعطي التوازن بين الشريعة. فالوسطية في أحكام الشريعة هي إذا مطلوبة، لأنها تحقق التوازن بين الأعمال، وكل الأعمال وكل التكاليف الموجودة في الشريعة هي كلها تحقق المصالح، وهي كلها تحقق الوسطية. وعلى ذلك يمكننا القول بأن الإسلام بريء مما يلصق به باطلا من تطرف وإرهاب، كما أن الإسلام لا يعني انغلاق على الذات وفرار من الحياة ورفض لمستجدات العصر وانزواء عن الناس، بل الإسلام دين الحياة في كل زمان ومكان. قال تعالى: كل من حرم زينة الله التي أخرج لعباده والطيبات من الرزق. شكرا جزيلا لكم. إن شاء الله نذهب للصلاة ثم نأتي إلى هناك أي استفسارات أو أسئلة. وأشكر إخواني وزملائي وأصحابي الموجودين على المنصة، وإن شاء الله بإذن الله أنتهي من الصلاة وأرجع أستمع إليكم جميعا. وشكرا لكم على تشريفي بهذه الفرصة، وسلام الله عليكم ورحمته وبركاته.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much. Shukran kathira, Professor Mohamed El-Gammal. Professor Gammal presented a lot of rich ideas, but there are a couple of points which are very important. One, that Sharia is impossible without wasatiyah, without moderation. Another point which is very necessary to remind ourselves that there are a lot of proofs for wasatiyah, be in the Quran, in Hadith, and the intellectual heritage promoted by our scholars in the past. He talks about wasatiyah in the sense al-hukm as-salim was-salih. In a way, wise, peaceful wisdom and sound wisdom, or peaceful regulation and wise regulation. This is wasatiyah. Professor El-Gammal is a professor of comparative fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence at Hammad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. Thank you very much for your rich presentation. Shukran kathira. We move next to the next speaker, and we apologize to Professor James Bourk Hoesterey for an awkward time. We know it's 3 o'clock in the morning over there. Thank you very much for joining us at this very difficult hours. Professor Hoesterey is professor of religion at Emory University in Atlanta, in the state of Georgia. He was a fellow at a number of universities in the United States of America, among them Stanford University, Lake Forest College in Illinois, and the University of Michigan in Michigan. His recent book, or latest book, is Rebranding Islam, Piety, Prosperity, and a Self-Help Guru, in which he discusses the rise and the fall again. And we are very grateful for your joining us at this very important moment. And before I give floor to Professor Hoesterey, I'd like to also introduce all the other two. Professor Adis Duderija, senior lecturer at the School of Humanities, Languages, and Social Sciences in Griffith University in Australia. Professor Duderija is a senior fellow at the Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at the same university. His research and cultural interests include contemporary Islam, gender equality, and also religious interfaith dialogue. Last but not least, our dear Professor Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh is a professor at the Institute of Political Studies in Paris, specializing in human security, peace building, counterterrorism, and radicalization. Professor Tadjbakhsh has taught at Georgetown University, Columbia University, and a number of other universities in different parts of the world, including in Tehran, in New Delhi, Kabul, and Moscow. She also served as an international consultant for the United Nations and an advisor for the government of Kazakhstan. Let me say one more thing about Professor Hoesterey before I give Professor Hoesterey the floor, that his research interests and teaching interests include Islam, popular culture, moral subjectivity, and religious authority. He also has worked in worldwide broadcasting, producing a number of documentary films on Indonesia and Ethiopia, aired on Discovery Channel, the BBC, and a few others. I would like to give floor now to Professor Hoesterey, and you will have more or less 20 minutes. Please, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bu. Terima kasih banyak. Is it better to use Indonesian or English?
I think Indonesian would be better probably. But of course, the other two professors may not understand what you are talking. Yeah, it's up to you. You have a choice.
Okay, maybe gado-gado, yeah.
Yeah, gado-gado is better, I think.
Okay, just so I can respect the other professors. Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Al-Bukhari Institute for the invitation, for the work that you do on Hadith, and to you, Bu, for moderating this particular session, and to everyone involved, especially my esteemed co-panelists whose work I know and really respect. I will keep to the time today. Sorry, let me start my stopwatch so I don't go over time. Please feel free to interrupt if I do. And if you'll permit me, I'll in just a moment share a screen. The title today is on Islam, moderate Islam in Indonesia, Egypt, and Morocco. And I think the reason those three countries have been put together is I currently run a very large grant, research grant, looking at, there's about a team of 8 or 9 of us, specifically looking at the Wasatiyah in Indonesia, Egypt, and Morocco. My own specialty, of course, is Indonesia. So I will focus mostly on Indonesia today, but use at the very end Egypt and Morocco as case studies and as reasons why we must be also skeptical when concepts such as Wasatiyah become politicized in a particular geopolitical moment in which countries are looking both to the West in a post 9/11 moment and also to struggle for religious authority within the Muslim majority countries themselves. So if you'll permit me, I'm just going to share, excuse me, share my screen, and I will pick, okay, slideshow from the start. And can you see that slide okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and move this down so that it doesn't get into any of the things. So moderate Islam in Egypt, Morocco, and Indonesia. Now, I start with moderate Islam in quotation marks because, you know, sebenarnya apa itu wasatiyah? Apa itu Islam moderat? Apa itu moderasi beragama? So when we take these things seriously as language, as discourse, they are very different. What moderate Islam means to Indonesia and what wasatiyah means in Indonesia and what Islam moderat means in Indonesia. Even between those three phrases, we can have differences. If we look to the work of people like Yasmin Moll in Egypt in particular, she can show how both the Salafists and the kind of more progressive Muslims in Egypt are both trying to claim meaning with Islam, with moderate Islam and wasatiyah. Now, the reason it's also dangerous when we talk about moderate Islam in the English language is that comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of assumptions. I use this cartoon from an American newspaper to show why. So in America right now, in much of the West, moderate Islam, this concept, is a geostrategic concept in terms of its understanding and its dealing with Muslim majority countries in light of Islamic terrorism. Of course, the idea of wasatiyah was not always connected to Islamic extremism or religious extremism more broadly. Now, some of the problem with this is that there's the idea that there are no moderate Muslims. Of course, all of us who know Muslims and know about Islam as academics know this, but especially in the United States, where information about Islam is very seldom accurate, you can get cartoons like this that say the moderate Muslim response to Islamic terrorists, but the joke, not a funny one, is that there's nobody at the podium. Consider this other slide right here, the moderate Muslim. And then one person says, what's he doing, praying to Mecca? No, he's burying his head in the sand. This idea that moderate Muslims just don't get it, the fact that there are extremists of whatever variety. Now, part of this problem, and Mahmoud Mamdani, the fantastic scholar of post-colonial studies, has spoken of this as the good Muslim, bad Muslim. And what I'd like to say today as a word of caution is that Muslim majority countries, especially Indonesia, Egypt, and Morocco, have, in promoting moderate Islam, in promoting wasatiyah, have also to some extent bought into this dichotomy of Muslim yang baik, Muslim yang buruk. Padahal mestinya nggak begitu. So we shouldn't understand this as a dichotomy, but as Mahmoud Mamdani writes, there are no readily available good Muslims split off from the bad, which would allow for the embrace of the former and the casting off of the latter. Now, this has some of its roots in post 9/11 American foreign policy, Western foreign policy. But I want to say that this idea of a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, this is where the cultural, the political, and the religious all come together. And so I'll explain how sometimes Western countries want to support so-called moderate Islam, but their idea of what a moderate Muslim is often one who doesn't practice, one who is more secular leaning. In France, somebody who is okay with French ideas of secularity and laïcité in particular. So as a cultural anthropologist, I'm going to approach this topic not from theology, not from the Quran. We know the Quranic passages about the Muslim people as the chosen people and as the people of the wasatan, the people of the middle path. In fact, I think if we look for the English translation of wasatiyah, Professor Azim Mari Azra had it right. It's not really moderate Muslims, it's justly balanced Islam. And so here I want to approach this concept a bit critically, and also as an anthropologist, how it actually works in the field, what actually happens in everyday life, in regular circles of society, but also in the elite circles. So what I'd like to do is just share a little bit of ethnography with you and how I got into this current research project. I'm still writing the book, and so inshallah, in a couple of years, that will be out for people to read. Now, in my first book on Kiai Haji Abdullah Gimnastiar, also known as Gim, he was the kind of the poster child of smiling Islam, Islam senyum, Islam damai, Islam cool. Now, of course, before his downfall, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Kemlu, took great lengths to try and promote moderate Islam to foreign diplomats, journalists, etc. And they would take these groups, and I've been accompanied on a couple of them, to various pesantren, Islamic school, and religious leaders to try and show off Indonesia's moderate Islam. Here in this picture, we have the Afghan ambassador, former Afghan ambassador to Indonesia. There is our academics from Australia and elsewhere, and there are other politicians and diplomats, mostly from Central America, from South America, and from Russia in this particular group. And so what I want to suggest is that this concept of moderate Islam is something that, at least in the Indonesian case, very much connected to, in its recent iteration, to the policies and choices in democratic Indonesia about how to promote Indonesia, especially if we remember Indonesia of 22 years ago, 2 years after the downfall of Suharto. We had interreligious violence. We had different, whether it was religious or not, got framed as religious violence in Eastern Indonesia, whether Maluku, Ambon, wherever, different ethnic strife in Poso. And so we also had the bomb blast in Bali. And so Indonesia was trying to tell a different story to the world about itself, that we are not going to become a country that balkanizes. We are going to become a country that comes together in the name of moderate Islam, tolerance, etc. So much so that then Minister Wirayuda said in 2009, and Minister Wirayuda is the architect of this program in many respects. He's not himself known as a personally pious person or someone who's promoting himself as a religious leader, but as a politician, as a diplomat, he brought together many of Indonesia's major religious organizations to help work with the government to promote Indonesian Islam abroad. He says, I am here to tell you that Indonesia, the country with the world's largest Muslim population, has long prepared itself to answer President Obama's call for partnership. I want to emphasize that this idea of moderate Islam and that Indonesia promoting itself as the home of moderate Islam, which is also what Morocco wants to do, what Malaysia wants to do, what Egypt wants to do, what even Turkey wants to do, although they will not, Erdogan won't use that phrase. That this is a competition within Islam in the West, within Islam, and then also different Muslim countries in the West. Now, as an anthropologist, typically anthropologists studied in villages and small-scale societies. Well, at the moment, anthropologists are now studying in these elite spaces, such as political scientists do, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Ministry of Religion, and elsewhere. It's an effort to study up, in the sense of Laura Nader, who urged anthropologists to study these systems of power. Now, here in Indonesia, one of the institutes that have done this is the Institute for Peace and Democracy, founded by Hassan Wirayuda, as well as several other politicians, such as the former president Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. Now, they promoted and put on the Bali Democracy Forum, which is now in its 12th year. And during the Arab Spring, they held civil society meetings with representatives from Tunisia and from Egypt. Now, here is one of 4 of those, the Egypt-Indonesia Dialogue on Constitutional Reform, on how to get the military out of society, which compared to Egypt of today, Indonesia has done quite well, especially as we look at the way in which El-Sisi has transformed Indonesia just in a couple of years. Figures like former ambassador to the US, Ambassador Dino Patijalal, himself a political scientist, was trying to use the Indonesian model as a way to also become a broader peace broker, to leverage its position on the global, on kind of global geopolitics. He brought a group, and this is where public diplomacy comes in. He brought in a group of about 12 very high-profile Indonesian religious leaders, including Almarhum Slamet Effendi Yusuf from NU, behind right here, Imam Shamsi Ali, Nasaruddin Umar, as well as many others. And they went to the Middle East with 12 American interfaith scholars, activists, and they met with several leaders in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And this was an attempt by Indonesian foreign policy to try and have a greater, larger role, what Greg Feely has referred to as Indonesia's aspirational powers, or great aspirations, or great power aspirations, sorry. Maklum, ini sudah jam 3-an di pagi di sini. Now, the Bali Democracy Forum in 2016 also hosted an event on religious pluralism. The theme for that year was religion, pluralism, and democracy. Now, they took a lot of the delegates from the Bali Democracy Forum in the Hindu majority island of Bali, and they took us to the Bali Bina Insani boarding school. And we were supposed to watch tolerance in action. And the students gave us beautiful speeches in Arabic and English. And we heard from various teachers about the tolerance and the way in which the Hindus and Muslims get along. Now, at that time, the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States stood up and said, I'm so impressed with this. Islam moderat di Indonesia begitu luar biasa. Ini contohnya di dalam pesantren ini juga luar biasa. Kami sumbangkan, we are going to donate $50,000 US. Now, can you imagine? And there's been a recent article by James Dorsey about this. Indonesia and Saudi Arabia have very different ideas about what Islam moderat, what wasatiyah is. where Sufism can fit in, if anywhere, into this profile. And so here, when we talk about wasatiyah, we're going to get into the religious cleavages within Islam, even more so than between Islam and the West, in that kind of supposed dichotomy. Many people were a bit worried about Saudi Arabia, and as I've explored elsewhere, Indonesia and Saudi Arabia have very tenuous international relations, despite the fact that Indonesia has the most pilgrims on the Hajj every year, the last two with being an exception. Now, the traditionalist organization Nahdlatul Ulama has also in 2016 held the International Summit of Moderate Islamic Leaders. This is part of a competition, as I mentioned, of several countries to claim this role as the exemplar of moderate Islam. Now, they invited about 35 ulama from around the world. Many of them were from Jordan and Turkey, who come to several other NU events. And it's kind of significant that many of them also were very much aligned with Sufism. Now, sorry, I'll share one quick story here. One of the speakers for this, of course, was at that time one of the chairs of NU, Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin, who is now the vice president. So if we're going to talk about moderation and if we're going to talk about tolerance, sometimes the leaders that Indonesia puts forward, whether it's Din Samsudin or Ma'ruf Amin or Zulkifli Hasan, whoever it is, these are often leaders who have suspicious records or maybe inadequate records about ensuring religious freedom, ensuring civic freedom, regardless of religious freedom, whether that's for the Suf, whether that's for the Shia, for the Ahmadis, or for the LGBTQ community. And here's where Indonesia and many other countries who claim to be progressives are going to have to do some serious thinking about what progressive Islam means with respect not just to religion in the public sphere, but to the role of religious and gender and sexual minorities. And this is a spot where I think the West has a right to be very dubious about these claims to being the exemplar, mohon maaf, of moderate Islam. Other academics have written about this Islam Nusantara, as Indonesia, as NU has promoted, this idea of an Islam of the archipelago that is somehow distinct. Although, as Saskia Schaeffer has recently written, this idea of a kind of plural Islamicate is actually the norm in Islamic history. I'm just going to skip through a couple slides. Some of this research was done with the Ministry of Education, where they are trying to train 200,000 public school teachers of religion on how to teach about wasatiyah. Now, allow me just a couple words towards the end to talk about the kind of politics of this. Moderate Islam in Egypt. So one of the countries that we're studying, it's not my expertise, but I'm familiar with it and read about it. In 2015, Al-Azhar University, the Grand Al-Azhar University, developed this program called the Observatory. And this was designed to promote al-wasatiyah, to promote a certain kind of moderate Islam, in particular against the ideas of so-called radicals. Now, in the Egyptian case, this is very interesting because who gets defined as radicals are often political opponents, not necessarily theological opponents. And here we also have to bring in the role of the state. And oftentimes when we talk about wasatiyah in Islam, we just talk about theology, or we just talk about classical theologians who have talked about what moderation is. But to understand this as a social phenomenon, not just a religious one, as a political phenomenon in Egypt, we have to look at the relationship between the state and Al-Azhar University over the last several decades. Certainly during the time of Mubarak, Al-Azhar was not known globally as some bastion of Islamic liberty and knowledge, but for being complicit with the state in terms of training, or at least co-opted in terms of training imams for the Friday sermons, and especially now under El-Sisi of being a kind of the official stamp or package of a kind of official statist version of Islam. So how can we reconcile wasatiyah with a military dictatorship? And my short answer is that we cannot. Now, let us move to a similar question in terms of monarchy. Morocco being one of the oldest monarchs in the world, How do we make sense of the fact that Morocco too, especially with the kind of relationship between the Boutchichia Sufi order and the state government, try to promote moderate Islam, while at the same time somewhat clamping down on the political rights of its citizens, on the idea of a democratic expression. Now, in particular, the relationship between the Boutchichia Sufi order and the state in Morocco is very interesting because, of course, it has close ties. There are different funding capabilities that connect it. But more importantly, where is the role of Sufism in a global understanding of Islam Wasatiyah? Now, here's where the internal theological battles start to happen. The Saudi Arabians, of course, for many in the kind of Wahhabi camp, they have very little time, very little room for Sufism as part of Islam, much less as part of the root of an Islam Wasatiyah. The other danger of picking Sufism, and I'll kind of end with this here, is that Indonesia uses it, Morocco uses it, Egypt sometimes, as so-called proof of a moderate Islam, that somehow the Sufis, if we all just read Rumi poems and watch whirling dervishes, that somehow the world will be calm. Now, this also has its history in Orientalist understandings of what Sufism is, both from the West and some degree within Islam itself in these different Muslim majority countries. The way that cultural histories get rewritten. In Indonesia at the moment, Nahdlatul Ulama is promoting itself as the bastion of moderate Islam, and that Sufism is integral to that role. Now, at the same time, some of these organizations have been responsible, and I'll stop screening here, have been responsible for some of the most tragic political calamities and killings and violence of our day, of the last 50, 100 years. So how can we reconcile Wasatiyah as an ideal with the political realities on the ground? Wasatiyah as a political project with the realities on the ground in several countries, both a competition and a kind of dance between Western governments who are very anxious about strategic and security paradigms. But my suggestion is that we try to bring the discussion of Wasatiyah outside of the security paradigms, even while acknowledging it's a political project on all parts. So with that, I want to respect my other colleagues, and I will close. I'm just a little over 20 minutes. Thank you very much to everyone for listening, and I'll look forward to question and answer. Saya juga mohon maaf kalau seandainya ada kata-kata yang kurang berkenan mengenai Indonesia atau ormas Indonesia. Thank you very much. Terima kasih sama rekan-rekan semua. Thank you.
Halo Ibu Asna. Prof. Asna.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hoesterey, for a very enlightening presentation. A comparison, the practices in the three countries seems to be that Indonesia has a better light compared to the other two countries. In the sense that because Indonesia is understood as a democratic country, promoting itself either at the global stage, of course, also internally. One point I think is struck in my mind that when the concept of wasatiyah, of moderasi agama, is being politicized, we have to be very skeptical, and it's dangerous. And we should be reminded of this very important point. Another point that when we speak about the language, either we call it wasatiyah or moderasi agama or religious moderation, it has a different connotation in a different context, and also when we use different language or expression. Last but not least, his point is regarding the perception in the West about the concept wasatiyah in association with moderate Islam. So in a way, Professor Hoesterey mentioned that if we really want to be promoting wasatiyah, the best, I'm not sure whether he meant the best, is basically the West is very anxious to see that the Islamic world, including Indonesia, is subscribing to the practice of the West. I think I will say a few words at the end of our discussion on this issue. Should we be moderate and modern the way the Western world is? I think since you talk about Morocco, you are very familiar with Professor Taha Abdul Rahman and his idea on the what they call Islamic mode of modernity, or an alternative mode of modernity. We don't have to be like the West, but we can still be modern, yet moderate, yet Islamic, and very ethical. I think I will stop here on this second presentation. We'll move next to our third presenter, yaitu Professor Adis Duderija from Griffith University. Please, silakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Terima kasih. I just realized I was muted, so I was talking and I realized that I wasn't being heard. I just want to express my appreciation for the talk just delivered by Professor James. And I feel like my presentation will not be as informative and as interesting. But I hope you will bear with me. My focus is primarily, and this is what I have been working on for quite some time, is on the question of, from the perspective of this conference's main theme, namely as to what constitutes religious moderation. I'm going to approach the question from the perspective of interpretational methodology, or scriptural reasoning, if you like. So, and I'm going to make some strong claims, and I ask for your forgiveness if I come across somewhat arrogant in terms of the kind of solutions that I provide, because I feel very strongly, based on my previous research and my own identity as someone who readily self-labels as a progressive Muslim, I'm going to make some strong claims and say that if we truly want to, the best way, if you like, to conceptualize, or the best path that can lead us to, answering this question, what constitutes religious moderation, purely from a perspective of interpretational methodology and to the kind of scriptural reasoning principles that are necessary in order to have a conceptual robust understanding of religious moderation. I believe that the principles associated with what I have termed or theorized as progressive Islam would offer the best solution, and I will try to justify my strong claim. So, my aim is very much, although I am approaching it from the perspective of Maqasid or Sharia, I actually, when I prepared this presentation, I didn't realize that there was such a strong focus on religious moderation, and I do apologize. So I did some last-minute changes to try and kind of make the focus more relevant to the conference's main theme. So basically, and I want to develop and I want to use gender issues, especially women's rights, if I can use the word more in a more broad sense, or more specifically how we can use the principles pertaining to contextualist approaches to maqasid of Sharia to lead us to religious moderation, especially in relation to renewing classical Muslim laws as they relate to gender issues more broadly and specifically in relation to the status and the rights of women in Muslim societies. So I do not have many photos. I do have quite a bit of text because I'm assuming that some of the terminology might be difficult for people coming from a non-English speaking background. So I'm hoping that some of the text on the slides might help the audience follow my arguments. So the concept of maqasid al-Sharia has been often used in concert with the idea of religious moderation, especially over the last couple of decades. You know, the works of Professor Jasser Auda, Professor Hashim Kamali come to mind in particular over the last decade. But I believe that whilst the concept of maqasid al-Sharia can be used in helping us conceptualize what religious moderation is or what it should be, if we dig a little bit deeper, we can see that when it comes to contemporary Muslim thought, but also if we look at the Islamic intellectual tradition from a historical perspective, we know that the concept of maqasid al-Sharia has a very long genealogy. Yeah? So it goes back to perhaps even the very beginnings of Islamic intellectual history in some shape or form. So the concept of maqasid al-Sharia has been with us for a very long time. But again, how this concept has been conceptualized and appropriated has always, by textual scholars, primarily the fuqaha and the usuliyun and mutakallimun to a lesser extent. They've had, different understandings of what maqasid al-Sharia is, where does it fit in the overall interpretational framework and methodology, if you like, the usul al-fiqh kind of analysis or framework matrix. So even in contemporary context, we see that the concept of maqasid al-Sharia has been used by scholars who we associate with the Salafi or Ahl al-Hadith manhaj. Then maqasid al-Sharia is also being used by what I call the taqlidi, mainstream madahib, yeah, as well as contextualist approaches. So when I teach my students one lecture on maqasid al-Sharia, I always make this point that there are different conceptualizations of maqasid al-Sharia, and often to appreciate these differences, we have to dig much deeper and deconstruct some of the epistemological and methodological and even ontological assumptions and principles that underpin and often are not explicitly conveyed, and they inform a particular maqasid framework. Yeah. So basically what I'm arguing is that we have these three different approaches, and I believe that the contextualist approaches to maqasid al-Sharia are the most promising and conceptually most fruitful in terms of helping us differentiate, identify, and delineate what religious moderation should be in our contemporary context. This subject matter can be quite demanding conceptually, and there are several dimensions to it, and I will not do justice to the topic, but to the interested reader, I would like to refer them to, and I do apologize for lack of humility, my 2011 book goes into a lot of detail in terms of differentiating various approaches to interpretational methodology. And I applied to 2 different case studies, what I call the new traditional Salafis and progressive Muslims. And I go in a lot of detail in terms of differentiating at the level of interpretational methodology and a number of other assumptions, both textual and metatextual, as to where do differences of interpretation arise from, and how can we deconstruct and recognize them. So, and I'm so pleased and thankful that my book that deals with these issues was recently translated into Bahasa, Indonesia, by Al-Bukhari Institute under the title of Metode Pemahaman Quran dan Hadith Antara Liberal dan Salafi. So to the Indonesian audience, I strongly recommend, if they want to get into the nitty-gritty details of what a contextualist approach to usul al-fiqh means. So I basically focused on the differences between the contextualist and the textualist approaches. And the semi-contextualist approaches in the final analysis often have more overlaps with the textualist approach rather than the contextualist approach. Yeah. So, okay, so basically my main claim is that if we want to really be in a position to delineate and coherently conceptualize and identify what constitutes religious moderation from the perspective of interpretation methodology, then we need to follow the methods associated with contextualist approaches to maqasid al-sharia, and they are going to actually lead us to this religious moderation. And I will apply it to, as I said, to the issue of gender, and more specifically to the status of women and the rights of women in Islamic law and ethics. All right, so what are the pillars of contextual maqasid sharia? So, as I said, I only have time to provide you with few keywords. As if you wanted to know more about it, I mean, perhaps in the question and answer session, we can go into it a little bit more deeply, but again, I refer you to the book that I was just mentioning in the previous slide. So it's essentially what I'm saying is that contextualist approaches to maqasid al-sharia are premised upon these principles. The Burhani epistemology, in contrast to the Bayani or the Irfani. So in the pre-modern context, it's associated with the scholars that I have mentioned there. The modern scholars I have already listed on the previous slide. Yeah? The idea of ethical objectivism, yeah? Which is in the pre-modern context usually associated with the Mu'tazili kind of theology, where the role of revelation is not so much to teach us or tell us what ethical values are. And I believe that a thematic and a comprehensive kind of approach to the Quran actually supports this view. And one of the most comprehensive studies done on this topic of the nature of ethical value in the Quran, done by Mohamed El-Gammal. He was an Egyptian scholar who died in the early 20th century. Basically, the most comprehensive study on this question suggests strongly, and in my view, convincingly, that the nature of ethical values such as al-ma'ruf, ihsan, adl, all of these ethical concepts in the Quran are assumed to be objective, and that the Quran merely reminds us of to be adhering to these otherwise rationally and objectively known ethical values. Of course, this departs from what is today considered as the mainstream methodology associated with the taqlidi Maturidi Ashari theology that has taken sides and is based on something called ethical voluntarism. Another element or pillar is a contextualist and a holistic approach to the Quran and the Hadith. I will talk a little bit more about the contextualist approach when I discuss my case study now. And the last point is this idea of a possibility, not inevitability, but a possibility of ethical moral progress. So this idea that we do not find, this is in contrast to the mainstream approaches that always, they believe that the ideals have already been reached in the past and should be imitated more or less decontextually. So this idea of the regressing nature on history and time that tries to retrieve the ideals from the past and approaches the past at best semi-contextually. And therefore, it is unable to transcend the ethical moral horizons of those times, based upon these commitments. All right. So now I'm applying it to my gender analysis. So when we look at the classical and neoclassical approaches to gender issues in Islam, and I will restrict my analysis here to, as I said, the role and the status of women and the rights of women in Islamic law and ethics, we see that the adherence to a Bayani epistemology, ethical voluntarism, and all of these different pillars of mainstream taqlidi madhab-based Islam will actually, for both manhaj-based reasons, but also certain metatextual assumptions, certain cultural presuppositions pertaining to the nature of masculinity and femininity, such as the idea that the public authority and the religious authority is always supposed to be, in the hands of men. So these conceptual, what I call the conceptual markers of masculinity and femininity, that are not necessarily, they could be reasonably, it's debatable whether or not they are also endorsed by the Quran and the Sunnah. What could argue that they are reflected in the Quran and some of the Hadith, but that does not necessarily make them Quranic. This is one of the principles associated with contextualist approaches. So, but because of these commitments that are based on both upon a manhaj-related as well as metatextual assumptions, the kinds of ideas pertaining to masculinity and femininity will never be able to transcend a patriarchal understanding of the Islamic intellectual tradition, and they cannot evolve precisely because of the manhaj-based commitments that constitute and actually give rise to neoclassical Islam. There is also an ontological element that I didn't really emphasize, but in my last point there, when we look at the way mainstream approaches to Islamic theology and the concept of God, they tend to emphasize the idea of God's transcendence and omnipotence and omniscience. And all of these kinds of ideas also tend to reinforce a patriarchal, hierarchical relationship between God and humanity, where God is on top, men are under God, and women are both under men and God. So to be able to transcend these constraints, and therefore, and of course, these kinds of ideas lead to practices and laws that in today's society are highly problematic. And they should never and cannot give rise to ideas that we could recognize as constituting religious moderation, because they are too patriarchal, too androcentric, and they are not compatible with gender equality as in any meaningful sense of the term. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do? What is required for us to actually, what kind of, beyond what I've talked about, based on the previous slides, I just want to present a very simple 4-stage model of how contextualist approaches to the Maqasid al-Sharia can actually engender non-patriarchal Quran Sunnah interpretation. Yeah. So the first one is this idea of comprehensive contextualization. Basically, recognizing that ethical religious elements in the Quran, social and legal as well, often were merely a reflection of the prevalent customs and let's say ethical standards and norms. Yeah. And therefore, as I have argued elsewhere, we should approach them as being based on urf. And they are not a ta'abudi, even if they are explicitly mentioned in the Quran, they should not be seen as universal elements of Quranic teachings. They are not something that the Quran introduced anew. But Quran merely reflected and tried to mitigate. You know, we see this in the grammatical structure of the Quranic language, where, for example, the divorce verses assume that talaq, that the talaq, for example, was something that was in the hands of men, and the Quran merely tries to implore and tries to kind of raise the level of ethical consciousness, if you like, amongst those who have social and political power and capital, and tells them, and in this case they are an elite group of men, tells them to recognize that they already existing unilateral rights to divorce their wives. However, it teaches them to do so with kindness, to follow certain stages and steps and procedures to mitigate any possible harsh outcomes. Yeah. My argument, and not only my argument, but argument of scholars that I have listed previously, such as Khalid Abu Faddal, Mohsen Kadivar, and many others, is that even the hudud verses, Abu Zayd, the hudud verses should also be approached from this perspective, namely that they are urfi in nature, yeah, not ta'abudi. They are not something that should be forever imitated, irrespectively. Yeah. So if we adopt this comprehensive contextualization approach, we see that Quran tried to, as I say, elevate or enhance the ethical and moral horizons of the immediate audience it was referring to. And this is, and from there, from the principle of mitigation, we can deduce a moral trajectory as a kind of a Quranic ideal that we should try and approximate. And a nice, in relation to this point, I have provided you with a short quote from one of my gurus, my PhD examiner, Professor Khalid Abu Fadl, who makes this point. Yeah. Yeah. So once we have followed these first two steps, we basically come to this. We basically say that Quran and the Sunnah wish to embody and promote certain ethical religious values. Yeah, and this is the whole idea of Maqasid al-Sharia. Yeah, but, and this is a big but, it is very important that these has to be coupled with the idea of the of what I've talked about previously in terms of ethical objectivism. We cannot, as I said, we have Maqasid al-Sharia theories that have been developed for a very long period of time. However, because of the underlying sort of fiqh assumptions, this Maqasid al-Sharia was never contextualist, and it was not based on ethical objectivism. They were based on semi-textualism and ethical subjectivism, and therefore they were never able to transcend the textual indicants that we find in the Quran and the Hadith. Yeah. But if you adopt a contextualist approach and say that these values are rationalist in nature and that they are contextually driven, what constitutes justice and what constitutes what is commonly known to be good, ma'aruf, that can vary according to one culture or historical period to another. Remember, I said previously that one of the delineating features of progressive or contextualist approaches to Quran and Sunnah is that they believe in the possibility of ethical moral progress. So which means that we can never say that certain ideals have been forever realized in the past and they can never be realized better, or that they are required to be realized in a different sense, in a different way, given a new context. And this is underpinned by an ontological assumption that Sharia and God are the ultimate source of beauty, goodness, and justice, and that we can always try to just better approximate these ideas given the context in which we live, but we can never fully exhaust and conflate our own understanding with that of God. Yeah. So if we basically follow these 4 steps, this will enable us to always be ever responsive to the changes in the context and accordingly adjust our understanding of what does it mean to be just, or what does it mean to be ethical at any point given, at any point in time. And we are not burdened by certain legal rulings that might have made sense in the context in which they have been formulated, but we are not bound by them, because we know that these interpretations are based upon certain methodological assumptions as well as certain metatextual assumptions. Yeah. And they are not inevitable. These interpretations are not inevitable. I failed to mention here that the concept of sunnah is also very important, because as I said, I don't have enough time. The way the mainstream Sunni Islam of that of Al-Ghazali that we consider today to be the mainstream Sunni, they also have certain understandings of the nature of and the scope of the concept of Sunnah that actually quite often depart from how the concept of Sunnah was understood in the formative period of Islam. And I have edited a volume on the concept of Sunnah that was published in 2015, I believe. So that's another very important element that I didn't really have time to discuss. So in conclusion, my strong claim is that if we want to identify a methodology of interpretation and certain scriptural interpretational principles that can lead us to religious moderation, I am convinced that the only path that can really truly qualify and can lead us to religious moderation, as I try to explain in relation to the gender issue, is that the one associated with contextualist approaches to Maqasid al-Sharia based on rationalist Islamic theology and ethically objectivist approaches. Because, as I said, they are not burdened or they are not restricted. The interpretational outcomes, the ahkam and the ethics are not overpowered or limited by the pool of interpretations that we have inherited from classical Islam. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this was useful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation. I think the conclusion at the end is summarized very well the presentation in a way suggesting that Maqasid al-Sharia is the way forward. If we find a proper way, a proper methodological way of interpreting the Quran and the tradition of Hadith, will surely lead us to religious moderation and also to gender equality. Another point which was very interesting, I think this is very strong in the Islamic tradition, that God is the ultimate source of beauty, good, and justice. this statement and expression in the Islamic tradition should allow us to always find the way to approach that ultimate goodness, that ultimate justice, ultimate beauty, which belongs to God. I think this is a very rich presentation. Again, we will approach now the last but not least presentation from our dear colleague, Professor Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh. It's Khanum Shahrbanou is very, very interesting. This is close to our heart, especially she's going to speak a very positive, hopefully a very positive note of religion in the sense as a source of peace and harmony, moderating, enriching our heart, hopefully also our mind. Please, Khanum, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I really appreciate this opportunity to also share a few thoughts. I am not, as the speakers before me, a scholar of religion, but I have been listening, and I'm very, very honored to be part of this dialogue. And I hope that my modest contributions, which are very personal and based on my own personal experiences, may be able to contribute to this these discussions and this dialogue. And I'd like to also start by thanking Mr. Abdul Qadir Munte from the Executive Director of Al-Bukhari Institute, who I had the pleasure of meeting just a few days ago when I was doing an evaluation for the UN on a project on prevention of violent extremism. So I'm honored to be invited to speak today. Now, I'm not, as I said, a scholar of religion, but I'm a scholar of human security, of security issues. I come from that world, but I'm trying to actually humanize the world of security. I'm best known for my work on conceptualizing human security and now working on this concept of humane security. But something happened very specifically around me, and that actually made me really think, because first of all, as you have noticed, I am Iranian, but I grew up in the West. I studied in the US, I'm American educated. I've been living in France for the past 20 years, but I have also been working in Central Asia, in the countries of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan for the past 30 years. And for the past 20 years, I've been working in Afghanistan. So therefore, I have been dealing with this question of violence and what to do about violence in contexts that are not Western. So very much this context of Afghanistan. Now, what is the trigger that made me think about what I am going to talk about now? It was in 19th of March of 2015. So we're talking almost seven years ago. A lady called Farkhunda Malikzadeh. She was 27 years old. She lived in Kabul and she was a religious student. She went to see the imam of this, a mosque in the middle of Kabul, which is called the Shahid Shamshir Mosque, and to talk to the mullah there, and said mullah, his name was Zainuddin, and she wanted to basically complain about his practice of selling amulets. Yes, because he was making a lot of his money from this practice, he was very threatened by this woman and said out loud that she's burnt the Quran, because I think she might have burned some of the amulets from him. And so basically he called out and he said, she just burned the Quran. There were 300 young men who were praying in that mosque that day. It was on a Friday. They basically, I'm going to read you what happened, because I actually saw all of this on video, but this is what Wikipedia writes, and I just look at this violence. The mob dragged Farkhunda into the street and beat and stomped her. She was bludgeoned with sticks and rocks outside the mosque, then placed into the road and run over with a car, dragging her body almost 100 meters. Police offered no resistance and directed traffic around the scene. The mob then dragged her body to the nearby bank of the Kabul River, took turns stoning her and set her on fire. Her body was soaked in blood and would not burn. So the crowd ripped off articles of their own clothing to ignite and maintain the fire. The mob shouted the takbir during the lynching. So this public lynching, and this is something that we all witnessed it because it was filmed from multiple angles. And it was a really turning point. I'm sorry, I'm still even crying when I think about that. It was a turning point in my life. And I was thought to myself, we keep talking about Islam as a religion of peace, and Islam is a moderate religion of peace that loves peace, is anti-violence, and is not anti-progress, which is the text that came from the Summit of the World Leaders in Jakarta. But what went wrong? What went wrong? That 300 men, I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. Just imagining the 300 men in the name of religion stomp on a woman, right, and burn her and throw her in the river. Where did we go wrong with that, right? So then I thought to myself, and also then I was thinking that how comes religion, which was at, in the heart of Asia, which is Afghanistan, my own country, Iran, Central Asia, the cradle of poetry, the cradle of Sufism, the cradle of moderation, has become a center of fundamentalism. What exactly happened? Now, the opportunity for actually putting this thinking into some kind of a theory came in 2016, a year later, when I attended the Herat Security Dialogue. Now, Herat Security Dialogue is a security dialogue among scholars of security issues, right? So I was there to talk about counterterrorism, violent extremism, etc. And for 3 days, all we heard, then when my speech came, I went up there and I said, for 3 days, all we're hearing is that NATO should bring security. President Karzai should bring security. The American forces should bring security. But we are so violent in our own hearts, right? That we can actually, what happened to Fakhon, that was such extreme. But how much do we actually express violence in our everyday life? Men over women, women over children, children over animals. Are we a peaceful society, or are we peaceful people to start with, before claiming that security comes from outside by NATO or by defense forces? We need to rethink this entire concept of his security and soften politics by interjecting some soul, ruh, with international calculations that come with security. We need to counter violence, hatred, and ultimately male pride with a feminine elegance, subtlety, coupled with a poetic sense, right? We need to actually rethink exactly why our societies are constantly claiming that we need to have security versus our hearts are so dark. So I actually dare to say on stage in front of all my Afghan colleagues that the problem is that we've been raised as Muslims, alhamdulillah, but as Muslims who fear God. So we are, we've learned about religion in a way that actually is about punishment, in the afterworld, etc. And instead of, we have to reverse this whole concept of religion, going from fear to the concept of love. And that's the only way that we can actually save our societies. So we need to go back to the essence of religion, and not the practice of religion, not the politics of religion, not the organizations of religion, but the essence of religion. Because that is where we will find the only savior that will prevent what we just saw, which is love. Now, the practice has become politicized, organized, masculinized, right? Institutionalized, and it has completely lost its value, the value of religion. So in a way, my big dilemma, the task in front of me was to try to get people to think about how we need to return to the supreme, the essence of religion, which at the heart of all religions, right, and common to all the different religions, practices, is the supremacy of love. So to turn to love, the ethic of love that exists in different religions, and if I start doing very preliminary, even kind of a survey of how love is explained within religions, and love and kindness. You start with the Quran that refers to God as being full and loving, full of loving kindness. Beginning of the Quran evocates God as Rahman or Rahim, which is the most compassionate and most merciful. Nobody is more loving, compassionate, and benevolent than God. The Quran exhorts Muslim believers to treat all people with bir, which is deep kindness. In Judaism, love in Hebrew, ahava, is used for both interpersonal love and love between God and God's creations. The Torah calls for the commandment to love other people, love your neighbor like yourself, and love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In Christianity, the practical definition of love is summarized by St. Thomas Aquinas, who defined love as to will the good of another or the desire for another to succeed. Christian love is motivated by the need to see others succeed in life, to be good people, to the need to love others, including their enemies. In Buddhism, we have that. Now, in Bhakti tradition of Hinduism, it's believed that execution of devotional service to God leads to the development of love for God. And as the love for God increases in the heart, the more one becomes free from material contamination. Being perfectly in love with God or Krishna, God as the supremely loved, makes one perfectly free from material contamination, the ultimate way of salvation and liberation. Being absorbed in the love for God is considered to be the perfection of life. Within Islam, within Sufism, now obviously because I'm Iranian, I have a very strong affinity with the tradition of Sufism within Islam. And Ishq, or the divine love, is a projection of the essence of God in the universe. Since everything is a reflection of God, beauty is everywhere, even in the ugly. God is the lover, the beloved, and the loved one. Through love, humankind can get back to its inherent purity and grace. So when we go back to our traditions and to our essence of our religions, and I thought, how can we actually turn this essence of love into an ethic of nonviolence for a society that is Afghanistan today, Central Asia, my own, etc. So there's a couple of concepts that we could use. One is love, of course. Anyone who loves, so I'm saying, how can we turn these concepts that come from the Sufi ethics, not the Sufi practice of the organizational, and I want to come to what Professor Hoesterey ended with about the problem of the way that we can think about Sufism. But at this point, just think about the essence of Sufism, right? Which is love. So how can we use these concepts for an ethic of nonviolence? Even first, love. Anyone who loves God cannot do harm to the creatures that love has created, right? Love means knowing the other and loving humanity. Now, I will say some of the words in Persian because that's what I was using for the Afghan case, and Sandusti. Unity, right? Within the Sufi belief of Wahdat al-Wujud, unity within God. Human beings are united in one being. As a result, harm cannot be done to others as they are part of yourself, oneself. There is also the concept of futuvat or jawan mardi, which is service in Sufism. It's a sincere service to others. It requires service to the disenfranchised in society, caring for others and doing something to improve their lives, which is the opposite spectrum of violence. Selflessness, as khudguzashtagi, requires empathy with others and attention to their predicament. The search for truth, haq, right, brings the person to honesty and a host of ultimate humane qualities: forgiveness, understanding of the other, empathy, compassion, kindness, veracity, righteousness, forgiveness, etc. It's an exercise in taking responsibility for one's actions and relying upon oneself. Submitting to the love of God makes one forget the ego and creates peace in the heart, which is the first panacea for nonviolence. Making peace with oneself then can become the peace for society. That's the beginning of peace for society, is peace in your own heart. And dialogue, acceptance of the other, and the possibility of negotiations that leads to tolerance and is against the very principle of takfir. Giving presence to the other when they are there by accepting them and listening to them is the basis of that dialogue. Now, all of these values are supposed to lead to a personal ethic that creates a necessity impetus, that energy of love for thinking good, doing good, and saying good. Now, thinking good, doing good, saying good is from the Zoroastrian doctrine, right? Maxim. But this is something that is for our ethics of everyday life. But having come up with, and then me and a few scholars in Afghanistan started thinking about how we can actually really conceptualize this and just, release it as an ethic of nonviolence. But there were a lot of challenges and a lot of opposition to us. First of all, as Professor Hoesterey said, the problem is that Sufism is associated with different tariqas. Some have been associated with politics and violence, right? So it's not just, when we say Sufism, right away, they would tell us that actually Sufism has been involved in violence, Sufi orders, right? So it's a new, so the critics were saying that's a new revival of Sufism as a new form of governance, you know, fearing that neo-Sufism will play a role in religious practices and it will interfere in politics. We have now this issue going on in Iran, where there is a Irfan Halqi, which is a specific type of Sufi order that's very politicized, right? And so, of course, obviously, it challenges the hegemony of the state. Now, the answer, of course, is that any potential revival of Sufi values, right, is not for a new political order, nizam, but for the morality. So we're not reviving in a political institution the way that Sufism has evolved some places, but the essence of it, which is that morality, which is about education and moral education of humanity. Now, second, of course, challenge is that, you know, the secular world is very wary of revival of religion. So because progress in liberalism is anti-religious, period. So even the liberal piece does not have any space for religion, right? So hearing the message that we actually need to work actually on the essence of religion for peace is something that is not accepted by those who would want to, you know, to think about liberalism. But liberalism is not just an idea for the West. Within our own societies, within Afghanistan, within Iran, there's an intellectual opposition to this idea from philosophers who are also adapting that view. They're saying that they are debunking the return to the values of Islam as recidivism, criticizing as an attempt to keep societies backwards. So they warn against a nostalgia to worship the past, and especially a past that's not always peaceful. So they associate reviving Sufi values with being anti-modern and denying the forces modernization and secularism. They encourage instead efforts towards reviving wisdom, right? Kharat, aql. Like they're saying, you are trying to go to revive the heart, versus that is not a place to go. You have to actually revive the brain, the wisdom and mind, because that is where modernity lies. And otherwise you are trying to keep our societies backwards, because the only way to go forward is through the brain and not through the impulse of heart. They insist that philosophy is the more suited theoretical and practical discipline towards the realization of true happiness in Afghanistan and all of that, right? So they juxtapose religion with this rationality logic, with Irfan, which is, or Gnosticism, which they see as ideology of the past, because it embraces the unknown, intuition, Gnosticism. Our answer to that is philosophy without the sacred is not adapted to be peaceful, more humane world. If you just want to do philosophy for the sake of philosophy, but not really using philosophy for an ethic of nonviolence, you do have to bring the sacred into philosophy and reconcile the brain and the mind. They're not two different things. They are not enemies, they are friends, and one without the other, of course, cannot do. Now, the fourth criticism is that some prefer to speak about nonviolence in culture. Instead of going to religion, they were asking us to go into religion, into culture. Obviously, the real region of Iran, Central Asia, and Afghanistan has, you mentioned Rumi, of course, there is quite a lot of non-violent traditions that come from our culture. So they would say, instead of going to religion, revive that. But the issue is that I was thinking that our counter was that society is deeply religious, right? So therefore, it is not engaging with religion is a missed opportunity. And all of our culture has a basis of that religion, basis of the essence of love of the religion. So therefore, and finally, there was also criticism that going towards this idea of love or Sufism means a kind of a tark dunya, which means, you know, basically withdrawing from the world, thinking about the self and not about society, because there is there's a lot of like, instead of thinking of what we can do with society, you basically withdraw from the world into your own mind to become a perfect being unified with God. But that is absolutely, I mean, even for the Naqshbandi, you have Khalvat dar Jamiyat, which is basically engagement with society, while you actually have your own engagement with heart and with God. So this idea that, you know, to revive this means that it's recidivist or it is actually isolation is not absolutely true. So there's quite a lot of things that need still to be done. We need to continue reviving this concept. Unfortunately, what happened with the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, all of our ideas just went up in the air now. Everybody is just thinking about survival. But I do believe that we still think that love needs to be brought back into life because we need to save this world. And now, as we see what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, it is maybe sometimes too late, but we could have avoided. There's the idea that, you know, it is not too late because every situation, though, becomes the precursor of a crisis in the future. So we need to have the revival of love within religion in order to create from that an ethic of morality, of nonviolence. That could be done, including by pairing figures of moral authority that exist within our society with the young people, so they pass on that wisdom, and so that wisdom becomes not just a little internet meme, but it becomes something that you can actually put in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and rich presentation. Earlier we talked about God's beauty or divine beauty. Now we talk about divine love. So the point to start from divine love, bringing love back into the individual heart or into society should probably lead us forward, especially taking the fact of the story. Professor, forgive me for missing your name, Professor Tadjbakhsh related to us. It was very, I think she was emotional, but also was emotional for us who listened to the story. And this story is not common, but it's not unique either. It's happened in a number, in different parts of the world. And also we have to remind ourselves, it not just happened in the context of Islam, even though she related, this was the practice in Afghanistan, she related, but also it happened in different parts of the world, not just among Muslims, but also Muslim being terrorized in such a situation as well. So her message that love is the way forward is a very universal message, but especially for Muslim, reclaiming our heritage, our Sufi ethics. She tried to differentiate between practice and ethics, but I would argue actually in the context of Islam, ilmun wa amalun is connecting ethics. You cannot differentiate between practice and ethical dimension itself. But the point I think is well taken. Love is the way forward. And this is taught in our heart, and from heart radiates to our well-being and self, and also from there to our society and nation and the rest. I think we have concluded the presentation, the 4 very rich presentations by 4 distinguished professors. And I would like to open the discussion to some questions and answers. And should we just take question in person, or should we look into the chat room? The organizer, please advise, what should we do? Should we just ask a participant to raise their hand? And I see one hand now being raised. And could we just ask the person to ask question? Should we do that?
Yeah, Bu. Some who raise his hand, can we?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, can we allow him?
Him or her to answer, to ask questions or give comment. Okay, please. The person who raised his or her hand, I can't read the name. Please just come forward. Who is the person? Can Sehat Ihsan, could you help? And or Masrur, could you help? Who is the person raising his or her hand? Anyone who would like to ask the question, just come forward. Introduce yourself and then just ask a question and specify to which speaker you would like your question to be addressed. Okay, please. Anyone?
There is still no raised hand, Bu. Maybe.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, from Bu Yuni.
Yes, Bu Yuni, you have a question, please. This is the problem of this digital presentation. Sometimes we can see the person. Ya, ini persoalan. Ayo, silakan, silakan. Bu Yuni, do you have a question? Okay, and if not, should I raise some questions then just to start, to break the ice? Yeah. Okay, let me ask the third professor. I would like to ask him one question regarding, you talked earlier, I'm very bad with name. I'm sorry for that. But yeah, Professor Adis Duderija, you talked earlier about transcendence, omnipotence, and omnipresence could reinforce the concept of masculinity and patriarchy. Well, I mean, you know, we talk Sufi context today. I mean, everyone presenting today talk about Sufism. Within Sufism, actually, unity and multiplicity always discussed equally important. Similarly, God omnipotence and God immanent also discussed. You know, when they talk about love, beauty, this is part of the concept of God. And in fact, when you look into the Sufi orientation, you see you cannot take just the concept of divine omnipotence, but at the same time, you have to talk about the closeness, the nearness of God to human being, which is closer to his or her jugular vein. So, I mean, to say that this is a reinforced masculinity, I think this is should be extreme, and in fact, can be debated. And I would like to hear your reflection. Hopefully, after this, we will find some other, participants to ask questions. Please.
Sure. That's a really deep question. What I was trying to say is, when we look at the gender roles and norms that are associated with masculinity and femininity in classical Islam, there are certain what I call conceptual markers. So, and they have been used, and they have suffused or infused themselves into classical Islamic laws and ethics also to give rise to certain gender asymmetrical rights and responsibilities with respect to each gender. So when we ask ourselves the question, why is it that many, if not most, classical Muslim scholars were not willing to extend Muslim women the right to have religious authority or political authority in the public sphere? And we try to deconstruct their views. We see that they had certain ideas about so-called natural predispositions, if you like, or natural roles that each gender was supposed to play, and they are highly gendered. So the idea that you can associate intellectual, political, and religious authority with masculinity, and passivity, dependence, weakness, even the idea of lacking in something, is associated with women. So that actually has real implications at the societal level. So also, if we want to examine what kinds of ideas have been used to insist upon gender segregation, we see that these ideas are formulated on the basis of a particular understanding of male and female sexuality. Female sexuality is strongly associated with a particular understanding of modesty, and that modesty reduces women's bodies basically to an aura. It reduces women's bodies to fitna, to the concept of fitna. So these kinds of ideas have been used to allocate and restrict women's rights at the level of Islamic laws and ethics. So when we want to try and make sense of why is it that women are not allowed to do all of these things, why women cannot be the qiwama or have the wilaya, why we see, if we dig deeply and we try to deconstruct these views, it's because the scholars of that time had certain understandings of what it means to be a proper man and what it means to be a proper woman. And the nature of male-female sexuality played a really important role in this respect. The male Muslim scholars have used the concepts of haya and fitna to constrict, to restrict, and to justify discriminatory practices, and not to allow women freedom of movement, not to allow women to have to be independent in terms of the kinds of decisions they want to make in relation to, say, marriage or the profession that they want to choose. So in other words, Islamic laws are highly, highly gendered. And my argument is that apart from certain interpretational mechanisms that the scholars use to justify their views in religious terms, there were other ideas that they uncritically accepted about masculinity and femininity. They accepted them uncritically, that had detrimental effects and real implications at the level of culture, society, and Islamic laws. Yeah? And so there was a hierarchical relationship between men and women. And my argument is that by emphasizing the Jalali sifat of they have also that kind of ontology has also permeated itself at the societal level in relation to the relationship between men and women, and especially husbands and wives. Yeah. So that's why in Islamic jurisprudence, some of the major concepts we find when it comes to husband-wife relationship is the concept of ta'a and nushuz that are primarily constructed in such a way to argue that women are supposed to obey husbands and be controlled by husbands because they lack either reason or rationality, because they have never been prophets, or they cannot be imams, or because they are biologically inferior. So I'm trying to say
I understand. Yeah. Okay.
That the hierarchical ontology has also permeated itself at the level of society and legal rulings, and we find that in relation to the dynamic between husbands and wives.
Thank you for the your answer. It can be, of course, re-challenge, but we don't have time here to do so. So let me raise also the issue again. Anyone, any participants would like to ask questions, please raise your hand or just come forward and introduce yourself, please. I don't understand. Normally, everyone wants to ask a question, but I do not know either because it is late during the day or everyone is very tired or whatever. But anyway, anyone would like to ask a question? Okay, let me, yes.
In the chat, there is one question about Maqasid or Sharia.
Oh, okay, please.
Maybe someone else can answer. I already answered one question, but I will be very brief. Yeah, it is easy to instrumentalize Maqasid al-Sharia and kind of make it unless it's approached systematically and unless it's embedded in relation to the broader discussions of interpretational methodology, as I tried to explain in my lecture. It is but one element in a broader arsenal of interpretational principles and mechanisms. So basically, my talk was saying that there is no such thing as one approach to Maqasid al-Sharia. We see Salafi, al-Hadith people using Maqasid discourse. We see it among the Taqlidi, mainstream Madhab people, as well as amongst the progressives and the Wasatis. So yes, I definitely agree that it's easy to instrumentalize Maqasid. Then that's why we need to do hard theoretical work to really give or develop a robust theoretical framework within which the Maqasid al-Sharia discourse can play an important role, but it has to be integrated in relation to other mechanisms and other considerations.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Okay, if not, let me ask a question to Professor Hoesterey. I have one question for you. And you talk about Morocco, as I said earlier, I'm sure you are very familiar with the work of Professor Taha Abdurrahman or Abdurrahman Taha, especially he is promoted now Bawa el-Halaq in his book, Reforming Modernity. My question, since you talked earlier about the nervousness of the West, when we talk about moderation, in the sense the right of certain minorities have to be respected. Of course, we all agree. The question, should the Islamic world follow the path of Western modernity in which ethics is not at the core? Well, Professor Taha Abdurrahman argued we have to bring back, and Wa'il Halaq as well, we have to bring back some secret to modernity. So there can be multiple modernity in the world in a way that Muslim can be true to their tradition, yet they are modern, they are ethical, at the same time they respect others. I mean, as they have done so in the past, even though not perfect. So let me ask you this question. Do you think Muslims should follow the path of religious moderation of the West and follow especially Euro-American model? Or should we have our own authentic and unique form of religious moderation, and especially modernity in the, as I said, in the context of the thought of Taha Abdurrahman? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Asna Hussein. I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate your own work and research for a long time on this and on tolerance, and in particular, as I study Wasatiyah from the perspective of public diplomacy, when cultures interact. I've written on the Indonesian Islamic mosque community in Washington, D.C., as you have also, and it's interesting to see these in conjunction. And so my short answer to you is, please, no, don't take the route of the Western understanding of moderation. But there's a caveat. So I would say that if we think about, Jeremy Menchik's book on Indonesia, on tolerance without liberalism, I think in the West at the moment, the way in which moderate Islam is understood by the population writ large is along these security paradigms. And certainly as we see from our colleague talking about the way in which it affects efforts on violent extremism, this can have a real important place. And so I don't want to say it doesn't. What I'm worried about is when...
Hello?
Yes,
Yeah,
Ihsan. Sehan, are you trying to say something to us? Oh no, I think it was just his voice. Forgive us.
Zaman dulu nggak apa-apa, sangat dimaklumi. So I think absolutely many people have written about multiple modernities, and I also wouldn't necessarily say that there's a single, of course, Islamic modernity. You know, what we see, if anything, in this is the competition of so many within the Middle East, within Southeast Asia, if we want to compare Malaysia and Indonesia's articulations of this. But I will guard us against also suggesting that ethics in an Islamic modernity paradigm is not the same as, or so different from Western ideas of ethics or sexual ethics. And by this, I'm talking specifically about, you know, even my own colleagues, such as Professor Scott Kugel and others who have looked at historically in pre-modern times, the role of sexuality, the role of same-sex relations, a different understanding theologically of the story of Lut, where it's not one about same-sex relations, it's one about sexual power. These are serious voices from within the progressive Muslim movement in the West, yet they are they are by Muslims in the West who are trained in theology by some of the best people. And so what I want to suggest here is that no, there should not be a litmus test for who counts as a moderate Muslim, who gets to claim that. However, when countries such as Indonesia claim, or organizations such as NU put certain people up as models, as exemplars of the moderate Muslim. When Zulkifli Hassan goes up from Muhammadiyah and PAN, yet we can look at a different history and trajectory of ethics that might be challenged. If we look at someone like Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin, Professor Robin Bush and others have written about his particular role as an advisor to President SBY during a policy period that was decidedly anti-Shia and anti-Muhammadiyah. So, or sorry, not Muhammadiyah, anti-Ahmadiyya. And so I think that those are real questions that can be asked that don't require Indonesian Muslims to go down a secular route of modernity, or even to think about wasatiyah in terms of global strategic senses. But we have to really look at Islamic genealogies. The rights of LGBTQ people is not a Western phenomenon that has somehow been imposed from the West. There are roots of this historically within Islamic traditions, especially in Indonesia, where we have historical accounts of accommodations. So in that respect, what I would like to just suggest is that there will be a lot of contention, both in who claims to be moderates and who accepts that claim. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to appeal to a Western narrow definition, but I think we must be ready for countries to have to kind of account for this. And, you know, a lot of those who are advocating wasatiyah, if we look at NU in particular in Indonesia, have many friends, dear friends and colleagues, NU has also been connected with different elements of mass violence in the 60s, especially in East Java. So we have to take these historical paradoxes and theological paradoxes seriously, I think, when any country tries to do this. And this is why I think we should talk about ideals, not necessarily a country who has perfected it. And I think that's the ethos of Professor Pak Menteri Hasan Wirayuda when Indonesia wants to share lessons, not necessarily brag. So I think that kind of Indonesian public diplomacy is really a good way forward. So sorry, mohon maaf, jawabannya agak panjang lebar.
Bagus, terima kasih, terima kasih. Kawan-kawan sekalian, I hope sudah panas. Mari, silakan bertanya yang lain. Silakan.
Itu Kasna,
Yap.
Kasna itu di kolom chat itu ada pertanyaan untuk Pak James juga dari penonton YouTube.
Oh, oke. Apa ini ya pertanyaannya? Berbicara
Dari
kalau
Mohamed Iqbal.
Mana-mana. Coba Ihsan bacakan sebentar untuk ini biar ini nanti kita terjemahkan kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia. Silakan.
Oke, ya. Tapi untuk Pak James kayaknya saya bisa bacakan dalam bahasa Indonesia ya.
Oh iya, beliau tidak perlu diterjemahkan.
Diterjemahkan. Ya, saya Muhammad Iqbal dari Banjarmasin. Saya mau mengajukan pertanyaan untuk Pak James. Indonesia memiliki dua organisasi besar, NU dan Muhammadiyah, yang dengan puluhan bahkan ratusan juta pengikut, namun nampaknya tidak dapat berkembang jauh keluar Indonesia. Berbeda dengan gerakan dari Timur Tengah yang hanya memiliki sedikit pengikut, tapi ideologi yang dikembangkan bisa berkembang ke berbagai negara termasuk Indonesia. Apa yang menyebabkan hal ini bisa terjadi? Mungkinkah model beragama ala NU Muhammadiyah ini cocok untuk dikembangkan di Barat juga? Itu Pak James. Terima kasih.
Pak, terima kasih pertanyaannya. Mungkin jawabannya bahasa Indonesia saja ya, mohon maaf. Ya, ini, waduh, saya jangan sampai panjang lebar lagi. Jadi singkat saja, ada dua hal yang menarik. Pada saat ini, kalau kita lihat dari perspektif NU misalnya, dengan Ketua Umum baru, Gus Yahya Stakuf, yang sudah berapa tahun beliau berkeliling di dunia ini di dalam strategi atau strategi diplomasi publik untuk justru agar dunia luar lebih dan dunia barat khususnya lebih memahami Islam yang ada di Indonesia. Nah, sama dengan Muhammadiyah kalau kita misalnya, tapi degree-nya nggak se-NU. Kalau Pak Haidar Nasir mungkin karena lebih ragu dalam bahasa Inggris, saya nggak tahu, Pak Abdul Muti, mereka juga keliling-keliling dalam beberapa konferensi, workshop, dan segala macam. Nah, yang menarik, ini pertanyaannya yang paling intinya begini, ini bagaimana hubungan atau reputasi Indonesia di dalam dunia Timur Tengah. Ini menarik sekali kalau kita ikuti tulisan dari Prof. Martin van Buenessen atau Prof. Rizal Sukma. Kenapa sih Indonesia begitu mengimpor ide-ide dari Timur Tengah, tetapi tidak mengekspor? Kenapa tidak menulis dalam bahasa Arab banyak misalnya? Nah, tetapi apakah akan diterima dari Al-Azhar, dari yang lain-lain? Mungkin dalam beberapa konteks bisa diterima Indonesia sebagai contoh Islam yang real, Islam yang true Islam gitu loh. Tetapi saya juga ragu, dan ini karena ada prasangka buruk, mohon maaf, prejudice antara sebagian besar di Timur Tengah dengan orang Indonesia. Terutama sudah saya tulis, dubes dari Arab Saudi, dia sangat mengkritik Islam di Indonesia. Padahal raja dari Saudi, dia datang enak-enak, nggak berbagi banyak duit secara perekonomian, tetapi boleh saja dia satu minggu berlibur di Bali, tapi nggak begitu tertarik dengan Islam Nusantara, dengan Muhammadiyah, karena sudah merasa bahwa Islam yang ada di Arab Saudi. Jadi mohon maaf, ada kesombongan sedikit yang sangat sulit diatasi oleh image-image Indonesia. Nah, dalam beberapa tahun, 2 dekade mungkin, Indonesia makin pede. Jadi bagaimana kalau ke depan saya nggak tahu. Tapi yang menarik, 100 tahun lalu, 150 tahun lalu, itu justru ulama-ulama Jawi di Mekah. Yang dicari bukan orang Jawi saja, tetapi yang dicari oleh orang Arab Saudi. Jadi kenapa sih 100 tahun kemudian jadi pembantu di sana? Mohon maaf, ini bukan saya mau kasar. Tetapi ini pertanyaannya yang geopolitik yang belum terjawab oleh pemerintah Indonesia atau pemimpin agama. Jadi mungkin saya mohon maaf sudah panjang lebar, walaupun sudah dijamin nggak panjang lebar. Tetapi inilah pertanyaan yang sebaiknya dijawab oleh orang Indonesia, bukan dari bule yang datang dari jauh. Terima kasih banyak atas pertanyaan.
Terima kasih. Apa namanya? Ada pertanyaan yang lain? Oke, kalau tidak,
Ada beberapa pertanyaan di ruang chat itu.
Ada lagi, silakan.
Shahrbanou juga sepertinya ingin memberikan respon atas pertanyaan Kak Asna yang pertama tadi.
Ya boleh, nanti ya silakan.
Ya, coba Kak Asna persilakan Shahrbanou untuk kasih komentar.
Ya, tapi
atas
saya mau bertanya kan masih ada
sebelum.
waktu. Ya.
Oke.
Prof. Shahrbanou, would you like to respond to earlier questions?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Please.
Thank you very much, Ibu Asni. Basically, there are three things I wanted to say. Number one is that I am not obviously putting the onus on the religion of Islam when I gave that example of Fakhonde, and I see that also in the chats people are saying, well, what about what's happening to all the Muslims in India, etc., etc. My problem is really first about what to do with the violent heart, and that violent heart connects every religion. My responsibility was to try to find something with the groups of people that I'm working with, which is young Afghan people, young Afghans. And I am myself also my own Muslim. So therefore I have, it's not that I have to try to sit down and just say, well, look what's happening also to us and victimizing, etc. I think that this is a universal. So that's my first thing. I'm not putting Islam under the loop, but I am working with Islamic societies, and I do have this question: how can we calm the heart? And this is a responsibility we all have, whether we are from each. The second thing I wanted to mention about male and female is an example that's I don't know if it doesn't answer your question, but within Central Asia, right under the Soviet times, the men would, first of all, within the practice of religion of Islam in Central Asia, men would go to the mosque and women would pray at home and stay with the family, right? So because the women would not go to the mosque. This is happening in a lot of places, although there are some mosques that accept, of course, women, but most of the time, men formal, women informal. And so what happened during the Soviet period among the Muslims of Central Asia is that because they closed the mosques, so basically the formal school, and they were very organized and state-sponsored mosques open, the formal part of religion became very also under the eyes of the state, very politicized also, right? Versus the informal one, which stayed in the realm of the family, was able to really evolve and survive and pass on values. And it just became a very kind of a different type of a practice of religion or even understanding, right? So we could actually, what happened is that you have the orthodox way and then the kind of familiar adat way of like the adaptation to customs and to culture. And so therefore I would say that even though of course there is no such thing as a man and a female, and there should, within the Quran, there is equality, etc. But I think that kind of open, the adaptation of religion to everyday life as an ethic of everyday life is something that really could be sought in the way that informally it actually evolved within the female sphere. I'll put that out for thinking. And third is that I would not, as somebody who is actually living in France, and I'm following quite a lot of what's happening around here, and I do of course see the way that the liberal values are so-called, what it means to be European, what it means to be French, what it means to all of this. But at the same time, I would not really paint these kinds of juxtaposition, or very simply wanted to say that the Western is basically, is not, what you mentioned, that, the choice is actually to keep a kind of a secular liberalism of the West, or have, I'm going back, I'm trying to find the note that you had mentioned in terms of like putting these kinds of juxtaposition, because what I am seeing actually in the West is a lot of a revival of spirituality in everyday life. So even the question of, environment, right? In the question of just in family relations. There's so much being written about the fact that what the West has missed out on with its liberal revolution, with reasoning, is actually the death of spirituality. But that is something that is actually going to be able to save also the planet, families, self-values. So I think that the spiritual revival that we are seeing also within Christianity, not even within religion, but within modern European life, is not to be neglected. And it's the same quest that we have also in our own societies. So therefore, everybody has that question, is what's going to save us and humanity? So the commonality is not this East and West. As somebody who keeps going between East and West, at the end of the day, I'm thinking we're not really that black and white. It's all the same. And it comes down to this question of how can we really revive humanity in all of these questions? And it's not about culture, and it's not even about differences in religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And truly, I mean, Charles Taylor, in numerous of his books, and John Gray, it's really described all of the point you just iterated, and thank you for that. And yeah, is there any other question? Otherwise, I would ask Professor El-Gammal a question. Yeah, could I do that? Yeah, Professor El-Gammal, عندي سؤال لك. قلت أن الوسطية الحكم الصليح والسليم. السؤال: لماذا الوسطية بعيد من بعض الجامعات الإسلامية في العالم؟ انظر حرب في اليمن، حرب في المكان الأخرى. ماذا نفعل أن نحقق وسطية في العالم الإسلامي؟
جميل، شكرا جزيلا لكم، وأشكر جميع الحضور والمتداخلين جميعا، وأشكر سيادتك. لا بد أن ننبه في هذا الصدد وأن سلوك المسلمين ليس حجة على الإسلام والشريعة، فسلوك بل تدين المسلمين وفهمهم للإسلام والشريعة ليس حجة كذلك على الشريعة والإسلام. وأنتم ترون جميعا أن السلوك في أماكن كثيرة جدا لا يمكن أن تحسب على الشريعة، وهي أبعد ما تكون عن الشريعة. فالإسلام يبغي أن تكون الأمة متحدة متكاملة يهابها الناس، تتكامل اقتصاديا، تتعاون سياسيا، يكون الجانب الاجتماعي فيهم تواصل بين البلدان والأمصار والبلاد المختلفة. الشريعة تريد من الناس جميعا بين المسلمين وغيرهم السلم والسلام، فرسالة الإسلام هي رسالة سلام. والله عز وجل قال في كتابه: لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا. فحق الشعوب جميعا في السلم، والحرب بين المسلمين وغيرهم لابد أن ينبني على أسباب حقيقية، والأسباب يعني إما تتعلق برد الاعتداء أو نحو ذلك من هذه الأمور. هذه دراسة مطولة قبل ذلك قمت بها في بحث حق الشعوب في السلم في الشريعة الإسلامية. لكن خلاصة القول أن مهما كان، وهذا ليس تقييمي للتجربة الموجودة في اليمن ولا التجربة الموجودة في أي مكان، إنما هذا الكلام عام، هو أن سلوك المسلمين في العالم لا يحسب على الإسلام، إنما الإسلام تقصد سلامة الإنسان أيا كان هذا الإسلام مسلم أو غير مسلم، وأن يكون المسلم يقدم العون لغيره، وأن تتكامل الأمة في أبعادها المختلفة، وأن يحقق الإسلام السلام بين الناس. وقصده من كثير من الأمور أن يتعرف الناس عليه، وكما قلت تدين الناس ليس حجة على الإسلام، التراث ليس حجة على الإسلام، إلى غير ذلك من هذه الأمور. أتمنى أن تكون الإجابة في إطارها المطلوب.
شكرا كثيرا. Dear colleague, I think we have come to the end of our discussion. We are very grateful for all the presentations and responses to the questions. One thing I would like to highlight at the end of this, before I pass this to the organizer, that achieving, first of all, moderation, even though today we discuss religious moderation, actually in the world, we need all kinds of moderation. We need political moderation, scientific moderation, cultural moderation, yes, religious moderation. This is my first point. And my second point, even though today we focus on Islam, but actually not just Muslims need to be moderate. Anybody, any religious faith or followers of different religious faiths need to be moderate, because this is the way forward in order to achieve peace in the world. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that there are many paths towards moderation, especially religious moderation. Transforming Islamic legal thought is one. Upholding religious ethics is another. And taking path, this is my actually the point I like to mention. Taking path of knowledge and civilization is one of the most important way towards religious, cultural, and political moderation, because knowledge truly enlightens our heart and our mind. I would like to thank everyone who has presented in this wonderful discussion, and let us all applause and be grateful to our presenters, and hopefully we'll see all of you again in a different discussion on different topic, because the issue of peace in the world is really our human issue. This is the issue we all has to aspire to it. Again, forgive me for any mistakes in my discussion, in my leading this discussion, especially related to, this internet technology. And again, hopefully we will see all of you in person in a different occasion. Thank you very much, and especially to our friend from Atlanta who stayed awake at this time, early in the morning. Mudah-mudahan tidak ngantuk ini. Jadi insyaAllah, and also from France, it's not too, and from Doha, it's late now. Okay, thank you so much for your time. And again, insyaAllah, we'll meet again in person in Aceh or elsewhere. Thank you very much, and again, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya kembalikan kepada panitia.
Thank you.
Ya, boleh.
Terima kasih, Kak Asna. Silakan.
Boleh kita nyalakan kamera sebentar para pembicara, dan ini untuk kita ambil foto sebentar.
Oh, everyone has to show their face. They want to take a picture as a proof of discussion. Okay. Yeah, please.
1, 2, 3. Once again. Terima kasih. Syukran Dr. Muhammad.
Syukran.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Pak Adis Duderija, as always. Mungkin kita langsung closing pada kesempatan kali ini. Terima kasih sekali lagi kepada seluruh pembicara, kepada Ibu Profesor Asna Hussein atas waktunya, dan juga kepada para komite, dan tentu saja acara ini tidak bisa terselenggara tanpa kehadiran para audiens yang sudah hadir sejak hari pertama. Mudah-mudahan acara ini bermanfaat untuk kita semua dalam rangka mempertajam pemahaman dan penerapan kita terhadap moderasi beragama, saya kira seperti itu. Mudah-mudahan bermanfaat. Sekali lagi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat sore waktu Indonesia.
Sore, alhamdulillah, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Prof. Asna. Terima kasih Mas Sehat.